everybody. I'm very excited to see staff, faculty, students, administration, local leaders. It's really important that we all come together and have these really important discussions about funding the future of public education, specifically in Holyoke, and then even more specifically here at HCC. So I'm here today, and I'm one of the people who helped organize this event. My name is Stephanie Marcotte, and I'm the Union Chapter President here for the MCCC, and I'm also an adjunct ESL faculty member. So the main reason why we're here is to talk about the Promise Act and the Cherished Act, which could provide well-deserved funding to our public schools, K-12 and higher ed. And if this were to happen, there's a nice big check back here, and we would be getting over $9.6 million a year. So imagine the opportunities that would really come out of that. There's been a lot of discussion on campus between students and faculty and administration and professional staff, just about how important this is for us and for our students and for our community. One of the major things that has happened recently is at a Board of Trustees meeting, we had a motion on the floor to support both of these acts, the Cherished Act, the Promise Act. And the resolution that was supported has passed. And HCC is actually the first college, of the whole college, state college, university system, to have our Board of Trustees supporting this alongside us. So it's really exciting. And so we want to see this grow, and this is a place to ask questions so that we feel more informed just how important these things are to us. So without further ado, we have 4 guests here today with us. Our president, who we know, Christine Royal, Senator Joe Comerford, Representative Aaron Vega, and our mayor, who just recently ran quite a bit, Alex Morse. And so everyone will be giving about a 5-10 minute introduction, kind of talking about the Cherished Act down to the Promise Act, what it means for Holyoke, and then what it means for HCC specifically. After that, the rest of the time is for question and answer. So if you think of questions, keep them on the tip of your tongue, and then you'll be able to ask them. I'm going to pass it off to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, and I'm also really delighted to welcome Mary from the MTA. I felt that Mary and the MTA and Max Page have been great allies in our work. So thank you so much for convening this. Thank you, President Royal, for having us. I'm really happy to be with my colleagues, Aaron and Alex, and really excited to talk with you about the Cherished Act, actually. So the Cherished Act was actually the first bill I filed in the legislature. And it was exciting. So I'm a first-term legislator, and so I thought, wow, what a gift to be able to have run on a campaign that really talked about the promise of public education, pre-K through higher ed, and then be able to have a strong partnership and be able to put in a bill that really embodies that commitment. And I love the acronym. So we got the acronym. Of course, the acronym CHERISH comes from our Constitution, that we're supposed to cherish education. So it's an act committing to higher education the resources to ensure a strong and healthy public higher education system. So cherish. And you can imagine the back and forth, just squeeze that in. But really it does, right? It's, cherish, like promise, really evokes the kind of opportunities that we will have when our state fully invests in our public education. I have the privilege, as you know, to introduce it in the Senate. Representatives Sean Garbely and Paul Mark have introduced it in the House. They're the same bill. So when you look for it, the House or the Senate will get you into the same direction. And so just by way of introducing this, I thought I'd answer 4 questions. Why do we need it? What does it do? Why support it? And what can people do? What can you do? Because it is this kind of community-based public and state house partnership that's actually going to make this effective, right? They won't happen. What we need to happen in the state house isn't going to happen unless we have, actually, honestly, convenings like this and robust groundswell, which I know is being is happening across the Commonwealth. So why do we need it? And I know many of these facts are known to you. So accounting for inflation, when we look at the per student cost or investment, which is how I like to think about it, by the state in public education, public higher education, we've seen a 31% drop since 2001. 31% investment drop per student since 2001. Sometimes, you know, I know that number, I say that number a lot, and it's still hard for me to imagine the kind of disinvestment that we've seen over these now last nearly a decade, 2 decades. So as a result of this underinvestment or disinvestment, Massachusetts has one of the fastest growing public college costs and the second fastest growing student debt in the nation. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So, and we know that as state tuition went down, state investment went down, tuition and fees went up. So we've seen that happen, right? It's happening, of course, across the nation, but pertaining to Massachusetts, it's also happening. So students are graduating across the Commonwealth with tens of thousands of dollars of debt. In our state universities, the average debt is about $25,000 per student. That means students are getting out with, you know, massive debt that's going to shape both their experience while they're in college, but certainly what happens to them once they leave college or their ability to finish college. The Higher Education Finance Commission report found that the share of higher education costs borne by students and their families has shifted dramatically, right? So we see that part of the reason the debt is so acute is that students and families are paying a disproportionately high amount of higher education costs. So that's gone from about 30% in 2001 to about 55% in 2016 of the kinds of costs that students and families are bearing for public education, higher education. So what does it do? What does this beautiful act do, the Cherished Act? So it is going to require that the Commonwealth fund public education at no less than the 2001 per student funding level. We went back to 2001, MTA, thank you, at a time where investment was higher, and we say, okay, let's reset, friends. We're going to go back to a time where things were more just and adjusted for inflation, and we're going to implement that to actually the recommendations of the 2014 Higher Education Finance Commission, right? So this is coming out of the Higher Education Finance Commission that said, go back to this threshold level where things were more manageable, more just, and work forward from there. So that looks like about more than $500 million greater investment annually for public colleges and universities like HCC. So they, and actually stipulates that these funds have to supplement, not supplant funding, right? This has to be new state investment. That's very important, right? It can't come in as other program or project funding while some other funding goes away, right? This has to be a $500 million boost. It also establishes in law a fair and adequate minimum funding level for public higher education at no less than the 2001 per student cost. Again, much like the Cherished Act, which Rep. Vega will talk about. The win here is in the added cost, but it's also in the law that would begin to change behavior over time. And it's going to freeze tuition for 5 years as the legislature appropriates the funds to reach the 2001 per student level. So we believe that in doing that, it's going to help address the student debt and help us all reach a greater equilibrium in terms of greater investment. So why do we support it? You're all gathered here. I know you care, as I do, about public higher education. So we know, right, that greater investment in education is a win-win. It's a win for our economy, and it's a win for the workers, right? So when, and all study after study will show us this, when we have a robust investment in public higher education, students graduating remain disproportionately, students from public higher ed remain disproportionately in the place, in the Commonwealth, in the place where they were educated. They are better prepared, and it is a virtuous cycle. It stimulates a virtuous cycle where students remain, they want to put down roots, they want to raise families, they've come out with a great education, and they want to stay, and then they get higher and higher wages, right? We know there's a correlation between good education, degrees, and wages. So we begin to see that kind of virtuous cycle in the Commonwealth. And it also will help break the cycle of student debt, right? This is, of course, not the only thing that we have to do around the student debt crisis, but it is certainly something that we have to do. And of course, you probably saw the study that right now in Massachusetts, there's student debt has reached about $33.3 billion in student debt. That's an extraordinary number for students just in the Commonwealth to carry. So clearly, this is one of the ways that we have to address it. So what can we do? Well, events like this are key. Certainly the kind of advocacy led by the MTA and others in terms of letter writing, testifying in hearings, and the kind of advocacy that we're going to need starting now and going through the entire session to win this. And so you all here are actually among the most powerful advocates and voices at this moment. Certainly we on the inside of the State House should and can do our work, but it'll be the kind of public pressure that you're going to be able to bring to bear and the kind of demand that you see for this legislation that is going to make the difference inside. So I'll stop here and I'm delighted to talk more in terms of questions. Thank you so much.
So, I'm used to sitting and talking. If I stand up, I'll start wandering around. So, well, good afternoon. So, backing up a little bit, backing up and backing down, I guess, from the good senator's plan with the Cherished Act, is the Promise Act. So, going back in time, 1993, the state was sued, particularly by Brockton and other states, due to the fact that the state, would not live up to the obligation, constitutional obligation, I may add, to fund public education, K-12. And education reform was born, and good things happened. And this formula was developed, and Chapter 70 was given to rise on a way to adequately fund public education. I think adequate is the key word just to keep in mind. And the Chapter 70 formula doesn't cover everything, right? So some of you, maybe if you're thinking about your K-12 district, and some of you are in some of the more regional or rural areas, I should say, and have a regional transportation pact, separate of Chapter 70. You have issues or concern with charter schools, separate of Chapter 70. Pre-K, separate of Chapter 70. Okay, so this is not the golden bullet, but it sure is going to be a really good, really good bullet. Okay, so a couple of things, and I'll go a little bit into the weeds, but hopefully not too far. But if people want to talk more on specifics, we can. So there's this formula, right? Basic formula that says every kid in a particular grade costs this much money. And then there's add-ons. So I know from the medical world, this is similar to Medicare or Medicaid, where you have your base rate and a bunch of add-ons, right? So, oh, your student is in vocational education. Well, that costs more in high school. So there's additional funds for a vocational student. Oh, your student is an English language learner. There's additional funds for English language learners. Oh, your student comes from an economically disadvantaged household. Extra support for that. And that's the two key ones, okay? So right now there are 3 bills. The governor put forth the bill, Representative Tucker put forth the bill, myself and Mary Keefe from Worcester put forth the Promise Act that is mirrored in the Senate with Sonia Cheng Diaz. Those 3 bills all are based on the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations, FBRC. You'll see that acronym a lot, FBRC recommendations. So 4 years ago, this nonpartisan group was put together, legislators, business people, educators. They toured the state and came up with these recommendations. It took them a while. They came up with some pretty good recommendations, 5 robust categories of recommendations. And we are trying to implement those. So those 3 bills, 70% of those 3 bills are the same. So we want a little more transparency, we want more accountability. We're going to address the health insurance issue. We already are doing that in some of the budgets. We all agree that we're going to do an increase in special needs. And again, if those of you that are really in the weeds and know about circuit breaker, separate, right? But right now we assume that every district has 14 or 15% special needs children. We want to raise that to 16 or 17%, right? So it's just assumed. But that 30% difference in those three bills is where 70% of the money is. So those categories, they'll have weight, right? And that economically disadvantaged category is really where the rubber meets the road. And if we're gonna not just turn around our urban schools like Holyoke and Brockton and our gateway cities, but also address our rural schools, which surprisingly, well, maybe not surprising to anyone that's actually paying attention, but maybe not conventional wisdom or the assumption, right? Our rural districts are equally as poor and equally struggling with a lot of the same issues that our urban schools deal with. So the difference is to take that economically disadvantaged category and give it more weight. And the governor's idea is to give that category 48 to 52% weight. Meaning that a child in one of 10 categories, we have more details, but there's 10 categories, 10 deciles, if you will, of where we place people in districts in poverty. So your Wellesleys and your rich towns are in 1 and 2, right? And your Brocktons and Holyokes and Springfields are in categories 7, 8, 9, 8, 9, and 10. The top 3 categories, 8, 9, and 10, have 76% of our kids in poverty. 76% of the kids in poverty. And those districts, right now, aren't even getting enough additional funds to pay for it. What do I mean by 48 to 52%? So if, easy math, if we were just giving $10,000 per student after all the categories go, the weight of the economic disadvantage, they would get an additional 48 to 52% of that. So they would get an extra $4,500 to $5,000, right? Well, the Promise Act and the governor's bill, and Representative Tucker, who's a good friend of mine, it's all good, his bill does nothing for the first, second, third, or fifth decile. So if you have a kid living in poverty in Amherst, or in Ludlow, or one of our Western Mass communities that are a little more economically advantaged, they're going to get nothing, despite the fact that it still costs more to educate those students. The Promise Act says everybody gets more. The Promise Act says 50% to 100%. Imagine getting double the amount of money for your students in K-12 for those that live in economically disadvantaged households. That's a game changer. It's a game changer because, not because the parents don't care, not because the kids can't learn, right? As the mayor has said over and over, it doesn't matter where you're from, right? But there's the reality. There's the reality of the additional services that our schools need to provide that aren't supported, aren't funded. Everyone agrees upon that in 1993, when we factored in and created this formula, that healthcare, nobody had any idea 25 years ago how much healthcare was going to cost. Right? It was not even conceivable that healthcare was going to become the death nail to so many businesses and become an iron on everyone's back in every public sector program, right? From our community colleges to our public schools to our municipalities. We all agree upon that. So we're going to try to fix that. We're going to include insurance a little bit better. We're going to include, everything's included in that cost. Even the superintendents, right? The cost, what it costs to educate. But the reality is that those special wraparound services, making sure that we don't have 30 kids in class, make sure that we have paraprofessionals, make sure that we have arts, make sure that we have everything else in our schools is going to come from the ability to increase that economics to disadvantage line. So what we're looking at is taking the formula, updating it. It's a good thing that everyone's talking about it. The governor's on board, the Senate's on board, the House on board. Everybody wants to change it, everybody wants to update it. Nobody agrees on the details. And that's always the deal. And so I think the Promise Act has set the goalpost a little farther out and saying, we need to do better. We need to do much better than the governor's plan, which was warmly received, lukewarm, I would say, received, even from the business community. The business community realizes that we need better investment in our education. Kind of fell flat in the House and Senate, but that's just the way the legislature works. Whatever the government puts forward, they just always like, yeah, it's the governor's bill, whatever. It's a starting point. So we actually have a hearing this Friday, and the 3 bills are being heard Friday. And I know that a lot of people are going to make their way out there. We're accepting written testimony. If people want to take the truck out there and testify, of course, we welcome that. The trick is going to be to do something soon so that it gets implemented for this school year. And what we're talking about, those changes in sort of how the pie is divided, and then of course increasing the pie, right? Everyone wants a bigger pie, is what we're trying to do with the Promise Act. We need to ensure that we put the pressure on the legislature, but also making sure that they recognize that they're a partnership. And that's what the Promise Act is. It's actually saying that we recognize the promise that education is supposed to be a collaboration between the state and the municipality, right? The municipalities that are able to put more into education, well, good for them. Lucky for them, right? They should. It's a good thing to put more money into education, but most communities can't, right? Because most communities are trying to pay for their education through their property taxes. And so places like Holyoke and Springfield and Chicopee and Worcester and Brockton and Fall River don't have that capacity. And it just so happens, I'll finish with this, it just so happens that the best performing district in the state, not the highest funded, but the best performing district in the state is Lexington. They get less than 20% of their school funding from the state, whereas Holyoke gets almost 80%, I believe still. But they're paying $18,000 per student. Predominantly upper middle class Anglo community, $18,000 per student. God bless them. As well as Massachusetts has the best educational achievement rates in the nation. Excellent. We also have the biggest gaps. And that's, again, where the road meets the road. It's great to be number one, but who are we leaving behind? The inequities are severe. So it just so happens that if a place like Holyoke, a place like Worcester, that's in that 10th decile, on economically disadvantaged, and if it was at 100%, Holyoke would get about $18,000 per student. Still educating a much more challenging community, right? But I would think, and I've talked to our superintendent, and I'm pretty sure the mayor would be pretty happy if we got $18,000 per student. That's a game changer. That's almost $6,000 more per student than we're getting now. So, at a time when Holyoke, I don't think I'm taking any of the mayor's thunder on this, but you know, we've been sort of flat on our enrollments in Holyoke Public Schools, and the mayor has been at the helm while we've gone just in 7 years, less than 7 years, gone from under 50% graduation rate to over 70% graduation rate, right? Still more work to be done. But more importantly, we're at a place right now where 140 families, some outside of Holyoke that want to choice in, want to come and enroll in our pre-K and our K dual language program. And we barely have 80 seats. 140 students. So this is key when we're talking about what we're doing with our turnaround plan. This is key when we're talking about building the middle schools. This is key. We can only do all this, right? So our superintendent's like, I can add another room tomorrow, but I don't have the money for it, right? There's teachers that want to do it, the families want it, the demand is there, but the money's not. And so it's things like this that we can move forward with things like the Promise Act. And hopefully, I would say, to hopefully the delight of many of the teachers in the room, that when schools like Holyoke and Chicopee and South Hadley and West Side have better funding and their students are better prepared, they're going to be better prepared to come to HCC and not be taking remedial English and math after they've graduated and passed the MCAS, right? So if something's broken there, we can't fix it without the support, without the funding. Again, it's not the golden bullet, funding isn't everything, but let's be effort about this. If the best community in the state is getting $18,000 per student, and some of our most struggling communities are getting around $13,000. Something needs to be fixed.
Well, thank you, Aaron. You stole maybe 50%. It is great to be here. Stephanie said before, I ran over the weekend, marched yesterday, so I typically take the Monday after off. But this event and another one we were at together got me out of the house today. So it is great to be here. Before I begin, I do want to thank, we have two city councilors joining us. Ward 2 City Councilor Terry Murphy, no stranger to Holyoke Community College and what happens here on campus, and no stranger to the city council as well, and delving right into education issues and other issues important to the city. So thank you, Terry, for taking the time to be here. And also our Ward 1 City Councilor Gladys LeBron Martinez is here as well on the City Council now, but spent nearly a decade on the school committee as well. So thank you both for being here and for your public service and dedication to our public schools. And thank you to Dr. Royal for hosting us today. Thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation. And of course, Senator and my friend and partner in government and neighbor Aaron Vega for his tireless advocacy in Boston on education and a number of really important issues to the municipality. And education funding is it's the issue of our time, really, when we think about what's happening in cities like Holyoke. I'm a proud graduate of the Holyoke Public Schools. I got a great education. I went to Morgan School in South Holyoke, went to Peck, and Holyoke High School, had wonderful teachers, had a great experience there, but I also recognize that not everyone was fortunate enough to have that same experience. I also was fortunate enough to be able to get into a TRIO program, upward bound program, which allowed me to become the first in my family to go to college, and then decided to come back to Holyoke and to be part of an effort to make sure all of our students, no matter what neighborhood they come from, what they look like, what language they speak, what education their parents have that opportunity as well. And so funding is critical to our public schools. And this check behind us for Holyoke Community College is what the Cherished Act would do for this college. If the Promise Act was fully passed and implemented, we're looking at a $26 million increase annually for the Holyoke Public Schools. And that's just by bringing the per pupil expenditure up to match the town of Lexington at $18,000 per student. So we're at about $12,000 a student now, and just by implementing this, would we be able to match another community and get an additional $26 million a year to the Holyoke Public Schools. And despite this inequity in funding, we've been able to make some progress. But number one, imagine the progress we'd be able to make if we were actually fully funded on these recommendations. And so I've always wondered, growing up in Holyoke, why is it, depending on where you're born, sort of dictating sort of your destiny, right? You're in Holyoke, you can look at the data, the graduation rates, the third grade reading scores, the rates here when students come to Holyoke Community College, percentage of the population with associate's degrees or bachelor's degrees, and the folks in the business community in the room know well aware the skills gap we have in Western Massachusetts as well. It really starts with an investment in public education here in our community, because it does pain me when you look at, we can cross the bridge over to South Hadley or go up to Long Meadow and see the disparities both in funding but also in outcomes. And so oftentimes we hear state leaders talk about, well, Massachusetts is number one in innovation. We saw it this morning. It's number one in education. It's number one in higher education. But when you look at the gaps between white students and students of color, poor students and students from more affluent communities, we're really leaving countless, tens of thousands of students in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts behind. And so inequality and inequity and opportunity, I think, is really the defining issue of our time. And we now have an opportunity on the state level to directly address it through the Promise Act. Aaron mentioned the Foundation Budget Review Commission recommendations, and the Promise Act is the only bill before the legislature and the governor that actually implements all 5 of those recommendations. So addressing the economically disadvantaged students, English language learners, and so Holyoke has a huge percentage of students that are English language learners. And just now, thanks to the legislature over the last couple of years, are we allowed to use Chapter 70 funds to actually implement programs of bilingual education, which we weren't allowed to do for almost a couple of decades. Special education, Aaron talked about the assumption that 10 to 15% of all districts have special education students. We're over 20%, and so again, we have to siphon money. We just don't have the dollars to be able to adequately address those issues. Health insurance. I know this gets into other topics around how we need to reform health insurance, and it's a great argument for Medicare for all, but I won't go there. But right now, we're looking at, just to start the negotiations with our health insurance companies, almost an annual increase of 15 to 20%, which for the city's budget is nearly $1 million to $1.5 million a year. And so that almost negates our progress that we make in economic development, expanding the tax base, increases in state funding, is just by negotiating health insurance with our carriers each and every year. And so we'll start at 20%, and we hope to negotiate down to 10%. But again, that's $900,000, almost $1 million a year added to the budget, just because we have this insurance industry and pharmaceutical industry that is making profits. And so that's a different topic. But what this bill does, the 4th recommendation, is address the health insurance costs that cities are siphoning away from the classroom into paying health insurance for the district. And not only is it the city and the schools paying for that, but oftentimes the burden is put on the employee, right? So now the percentage of health insurance costs that have to be borne by the employee are no longer 25%, they're 50%, sometimes more. And that's not fair for the hardworking men and women that work for the public schools or work for the city as well. And then the fifth one is a committee that addresses transparency, making sure that the dollars that are allocated in the new bill are actually spent on the students who need the money the most. And so Aaron touched on it, right? Just because you're poor, just because you're a person of color, does not mean that you're not able to learn or be successful. Obviously, we all recognize that. But when we think about the particular challenges in the city of Holyoke, when we look at the third grade reading scores, I mean, we literally have, the private prisons literally look at third grade reading scores when they try to assess how many prison beds they're going to need a decade from now. And so what are we doing in terms of addressing the 0 to 9 gap, the most important time of a child's life? We have a percentage of our population that we've been targeting over the last 8 years as part of a Holyoke Early Literacy Initiative to make sure even those parents who can't read themselves have the skills to be able to transfer literacy skills to their young people, making sure that all parents know the importance, be it in Spanish or English, to read to your child. We've been partnering with Girls Incorporated, the Holyoke Boys and Girls Club, Homework House, all of our nonprofit organizations that see our kids during the summer and after school to make sure we align the curriculum, to make sure that we don't have summer learning loss in the summer, to make sure that after school programs are aligned as well. And those are the type of investments that we need more funds to be able to make happen. The word gap as well. I mean, if you're in a community where your parents went to college, they've taken the SAT, they've been through that entire life experience, they arrive at preschool or they arrive at kindergarten with a whole vocabulary that kids in Holyoke or Springfield or other urban communities potentially don't have. And so how do we as a district make up that gap and level the playing field? Because oftentimes if you don't catch up by 3rd or 4th grade, you're almost destined to be behind your entire life. And so the question really is this important enough for all of us today to make sure we invest in the next generation of young people in the city of Holyoke? Or are we okay with the status quo where thousands of kids, mostly poor kids and kids of color, are being left behind in our urban communities? And so I just really want to thank the senators, the state reps that have been championing this on Beacon Hill. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us, local legislators, professors, teachers, residents, to call your legislatures, call the governor's office, and talk about the importance of the Promise Act, the importance of the Cherished Act. If you can't make it Friday, send in an email, a written testimony, a letter of some sort, and just talk to your friends or your neighbors about the importance of public education, because this isn't just about your potential kids, it's about your neighbors' kids, people you don't know, and the interconnectedness of our community, because this really is about the economic life of our community in Western Massachusetts and the region in general. So again, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to partnering with all of you to hopefully get this done this year. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Senator Comerford, Rep. Vega, and Mayor Morse for being here. I think we're fortunate to have very good elected officials that understand the value of community college education and public higher education in general, and it's nice to see them also putting some of their political influence to use in being able to advocate for some of the bills that have been talked about today. Community colleges themselves were an innovation in higher education. And the purpose of community colleges was to create an option for the working class individual to have an affordable, high quality education. And that's what we're about. That is our niche, our role. We are educating the people who are living and working in this community. And so when we talk about our students, we're talking about our residents. We're talking about the people that our employers are looking to hire. And so to me, this issue is a community issue. This is not just a higher education issue. If we want to have a vibrant Pioneer Valley, we want to have a economically strong Western Massachusetts, we have to have strong public higher education options. When you look, you heard Rep. Vega talk a little bit about the allocations in K-12. We get $5,400 per pupil to educate a student. The state average for higher education is $6,100. We don't even get the state average. We also have the lowest tuition and fees in Western Massachusetts. So what that says is that while we have been taking hit after hit in terms of a disinvestment in the state in our allocation, we have not translated that to student fees. So we have kept tuition and fees reasonable for our students because we know who our audience is, and we have not passed those costs on. We've instead struggled with how to be able to continue to offer high-quality education in an affordable way so that our students have the options that they have, and that when we're reading about the student debt crisis that our nation is facing, they're not talking about Holyoke Community College. It doesn't mean, though, that our students don't struggle with even $3,000 of student debt. It might not be the $30,000 of student debt, but when you're poor, $100 can be too much. So it's really, you know, one of the things that I think is very important in this conversation is, and every single person touched on this, but I'm going to say it very explicitly. This is not a higher education issue. This is an equity issue about our society. And if we want to have equity in investing in our communities of color, of which our home base, Holyoke, is 50% Latinx, then we have to continue to invest in having the dollars to give them the resources to be able to create social and economic mobility in their lives. So when we look at this, the Cherished Act specifically, you've heard a couple of times, this would equate to roughly $9 million extra dollars for HCC. We need this because when you look at the changing demographics of our students, we have a significant number of students that continue to have high needs. And in order for us to be able to provide options within our community so that they have good paying jobs, they have the skills that employers need to be able to make the movements in their careers, to be able to support their families, and most importantly, be good citizens, right? Education is certainly about making sure that individuals can have good sustaining jobs to help their families and themselves. But there's a whole other piece of what we do and why we are a liberal arts education is it is about making sure that our students are good citizens, that they're good critical thinkers, that they're engaged in their communities, that they can advocate for the issues and understand the complexity of the issues that are facing the communities that they live and work in. So we need to have an educated citizenry in our world, and certainly in our area as well. And so it's really important that we are able to provide those types of skill sets and competencies that students really benefit from. Critical thinking skills, communication skills, cultural competency skills. All of these things translate into things that are important in living and working in a multicultural society. And it's certainly things that our employers are saying are also important as they see more diverse workplaces, that they want to know that folks know how to interact with one another, that we know how to debate and that discuss issues in a professional, civil, and engaging manner. So higher education is absolutely critical to the foundation of any community. And within the Pioneer Valley, HCC serves 70 communities across the Pioneer Valley and Western Mass. So we have a pretty significant footprint, but we're doing a lot with less, and we have more and more students that come with other types of needs that translate to some of these specialty issues that Brett Vega had talked about, English language learners. We are educating nurses from Puerto Rico because they have phenomenal skills, but they don't have the language skills to be able to get the type of employment that they can, that they have the skills to hold. So we have to be able to continue to make sure that we can offer all the things that our community needs. That's high quality degree and certificate programs. Those are non-credit offerings. Those are partnerships with our workforce. that is looking at our transfer programs and being able to really support and provide great quality experiences so that they can go to any one of the prestigious four-year schools that we have in the area. Because one thing we know for sure is, as the world continues to change, having a high school degree is not enough for most people. And so we have to continue to make those post-secondary options available. So I'm very grateful that we have elected officials that are really investing in these issues, being vocal about them, and also advocating for such bills as the Cherished and the Promise Act. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to throw out one quick thing, just, you know, to build, Mary did some great comments too, but just one thing is, on the optics on this, right? This is not about throwing money at an issue, okay? Because this has been about underfunding and inequity for over 17 years. That 2001 number, there's something behind that. Everything is sort of being based on what was going on in 2001. 93 reform was passed. Investments took about 6 years. It was supposed to be a 5-year track. I think it took 6 years to get to fully funding. The next 5 years after that, you saw increases in the education funding across the state. Then it sort of stood still, and then it kind of went down. And when you put in for inflation, every governor and every legislature can say, we invested more in education this year in raw dollars. In raw dollars, yes, we have. But the reality is that we have not kept up with inflation and the cost of education. So this is not about throwing dollars or throwing money at a problem. This is actually investing in solutions that we know work. We know, as the mayor's been working with our superintendent, we know what works in Holyoke Public Schools to turn it around. We know what students need to support the HCC. These are not unknowns to us. And again, the Promise Act does have a provision, as the mayor said, that creates accountability and transparency to make sure that those dollars are getting to the students. So I just want to make sure we do that.
Yeah.
I think it's, you know, I'm kind of huddled in this little panel, and the whole time as I'm listening to everybody speak, the thing that keeps flashing in my mind over and over is that another future is possible for public education. And I think that's really the silver lining in all of this. And we're seeing it from different perspectives, from the State House to our town to our lovely college that I'm really proud to work at. And so now I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. If you have questions or comments about this, you could ask someone on the panel or the whole panel. But this is the time for you to really have those questions answered.
No, I don't have a question, I have a comment. Yeah. Something that occurs to me when you talk about the future, and I mean, I've been at this community college since 1987, and you know, more than half my life here, and totally invested in the mission. And as I, you know, kind of head out, I think one of the things that disturbs me is that we're not passing the torch to younger faculty necessarily. There's not enough money to, and I think HCC is doing a great job with what it's got. You know, you can't pull money out of nowhere. So that's why we're talking about this. But it's just something that I'm really concerned about is, you know, when I came in as a young faculty member, there was just this thing, you know, where we pass the torch to the next generation. And I feel like we're losing that. I've seen people in my department and my division leave, and there's nobody there to grab that torch because we can't afford it. That's not to say that all the programs are dying. That's not what I mean to say. But just that you know, maybe, I don't know, it seemed like there was a guarantee that, yeah, it's time to go and let the next generation take over, bring their new ideas, their new energy, and, you know, there are people who come like that sometimes, and we can't afford to hire them. So would this be, you know, any injection of money, I say, in college would help.
Part of this making, you know, from public schools is, you know, the teachers getting a little more support, won't feel something, you know, we have burnout on our teachers. I mean, I know, you know more, I mean, we've had some big teacher turnaround, you know, we take advantage of you know, Teach for America and those programs, because young people go to college and they want to do good, and they come to places like Holyoke, and like, oh, this is really hard. And it's extra hard when you've got 26, 27, 28, 29, 30 kids in this class, and you don't have a para, and you don't have supports, and they don't have, you know, they don't want to go out of the classroom for 15 minutes for one special a day. So this would be about, you know, a mayor and a superintendent could say, let's program things differently, at least at this level, you know, and give them more time and more space and support our teachers, maybe with salary, but also those extra supports.
Yeah, I mean, and on that too, in the Holyoke Public Schools, I mean, and I've always said, I mean, we have some of the most amazing teachers. We have teachers that oftentimes, I mean, I used to say as a student at Holyoke High School and the challenges we have, I mean, take a teacher from an affluent district that doesn't have to deal with 90% of the issues that we have and challenges that we have in Holyoke Public Schools, and they may last a couple of days, right? I mean, our teachers oftentimes dedicate their entire lives to Holyoke, and sometimes they flirt with different opportunities, but oftentimes they come back because they see the difference they're making in someone's life. But at the end of the day, teachers making X amount of dollars with a longer school day, with more demands, with more challenges, with things happening outside the classroom, outside of their control, and then can go make more money in a surrounding district with less responsibilities, less time in school, more time with their family. Some people would make the decision to leave the district, and some people have, of course. Others haven't. But how we're constantly being challenged because of the funding formula we've already addressed this afternoon. We have less money to invest in the most important resource that we have, which is our educators, right? And so another part of leveling the playing field, which also benefits the students at the end of the day, is having consistency among the teachers, making sure that there isn't turnover every year or even midway through the school year with different teachers, because that impacts the students' ability to learn as well. It's about those relationships. And teachers want that, students want that, parents want that. So that's another piece of the funding conversation that I didn't mention earlier.
And I would just add to that, you know, when we look at retention, the students, when we ask them, what keeps you coming back? It's often that they're mentioning a faculty member or a staff person that has helped get them through whatever circumstances that they have to transcend to continue to do well and to continuously be enrolled. And so, I mean, we undervalue faculty in our society, unfortunately, in that role. You know, it's seen in economics in terms of salaries, but they're very, very demanding jobs, and you do incredible work with very little resources. And it's that's part of, you know, what can change with more state funding.
I went to this year. They had like stuff where there was a lot more people about funding in Springfield schools, and they would mention how like some teachers actually, because of the materials, go ahead and buy them themselves. That's a big thing that happens. Like schools need more like support and like need not as much as a turnover. Some schools it's like teachers there for a week and then they're gone, and then you have to wait for another teacher and stuff like that.
I have a question about the Promise Act, and I'm curious to know, I really hoped that it would include pre-K this time, right? So what's the rationale about not going pre-K to 12 and remaining at K to 12?
I'll maybe with the MTA also, but so the reimbursement schedule as it is now doesn't, pre-K is not required by state law. I believe that when we were looking at middle schools, when we want to build out pre-K rooms, they're not reimbursed. So that's that's like another change that's supposed to do, especially, but I think now there's the momentum about, 0 to 9 or 0 to 3rd grade, like, oh, there's all this research out there. Government moves slow and keeping up with things. And which can be good and bad. But so I think it's probably, that's just not in the formula right now. That's like an additional change we'd have to do. So there has been these preschool expansion grants that we put forth. We've got the Early Educator Trust Fund. So we do recognize the importance of pre-K and early education and are doing these other things, but we have not included it in the funding formula yet. But I think I'm assuming we will.
And I would say, Holyoke should be very proud of its track record on preschool opportunities and expansion for a long time, but particularly over the last several years, despite the funding inequities and not having the resources to do everything we want to do. We've got a public preschool program in the city on Northampton Street. And a few years ago, Aaron touched on the dual language program we have. We were having all of these families that were opting their kid to go to their public preschool program, but then 90% of those parents were taking advantage of the free preschool program, but then opting their kids to out-of-district schools, parochial schools, or charter schools following the public education they got free preschool for Holyoke, and so we thought, well, how can we make the district, like our overall goal is how do we make the public schools the #1 school of choice for all of our families? So that if they think private, they think charter, they think parochial, out of district, that it's our job too to make sure we have those opportunities in the public schools for kids to stay. And we've secured a lot of the preschool expansion grants, partnered with DOC, Square One, Head Start to actually occupy space within our public schools to make sure to close that opportunity achievement gap. But again, I know we keep going back to the same point, but these are additional things we can invest in. Because right now we are investing general education dollars in preschool opportunities, because if we don't, if our kids come to kindergarten without any preschool experience, they're incredibly far behind, and that gap is incredibly hard to make up.
Stephanie, can I just add to that too? Yes, sure. So the challenge is we try to start with something that already exists, which was the foundation budget, and fix it. The good news is MTA is working actively with Raise Up Massachusetts, and we're in a moment in time where the conversation about the public good is starting to expand. And there's discussion now about once we get through the Promise Act and the Cherished Act, there's a commitment to growing the movement so that we're going down and going up. So we need to think about other revenue sources once we get through this, so that public education starts at pre-K. Right now, kindergarten isn't even mandatory, and many districts, particularly the poor districts, only have part-time, half-day kindergarten. So we have to bring kindergarten up to full-time, and then we have to go down to have mandatory, publicly funded pre-K. And then there's also a movement beyond the Cherished Act to take on student debt and have debt-free public higher education. So we have to realize this is a 10-year movement. This is a long-term vision that we have to begin to reclaim the public good. And once we're done with pre-K, we have to go down to 0, right? Because it's true. I'm a kindergarten teacher, and if students are not coming in with proficiency in any one language, be it English or Spanish or Portuguese or Arabic, we do begin to see the impacts on how they're able to read. So Max and I believe that, once upon a time, public education ended at grade 8, and then it went to 10, and now it goes to 12. It's all arbitrary. We believe that a fully educated person isn't fully educated until grade 16. And that doesn't matter what age you are, but you have a right to pre-K through 16 to be fully funded public education. And that's where we are going in the future, and in the near future.
Can I build on that a little bit? I love what you just said, Mary, about the common good. And I think, I feel that inside the legislature this session, there's a lot of talk of the kinds of transformation we need. Alex, you talked about healthcare, and that is a whole other conversation, but it feels like there's a lot of opportunity this session. Again, folks inside are talking about it, folks in the community, I would argue more importantly, are talking about it, right, to pressure the legislature. But even as we talk about the Promise Act and the Cherish Act, which together are $1.5 billion in new state investment, right, we are also inside the building talking about revenue. So there is, you mentioned Raise Up, right? There's this great coalition, MTA is a key member, and they're talking about revenue. We're talking about money, because we have to talk about this they're reversing this austerity budgeting that we've been having at the state level. The only reason we don't have enough money is because we've created policies over time that have winnowed state investment, right? Or the ability for the state to collect revenue that we need. So there is, our colleagues in the House and the Senate have taking in the Fair Share Amendment from the ballot initiative. There is legislation that we will put forward. It's going to take time, right, because this is going to have to go to a constitutional convention, but it's the same idea that was on the ballot this summer, which is called and you might remember it was called the millionaire's tax, that would tax people with incomes of $1 million and above, and dedicate the money to our education system, also to transportation infrastructure, which I know is another great need. But, so there's this opportunity, this common good, and then there's some vehicles in the Promise Act and the Cherished Act and other legislation to claim that common good, and then there's some movement inside, necessary movement to get the money that we need equitably to be able to do the work through this legislation.
I'm curious about funding, because obviously, this is great money. But who was it that fought the Fair Share Amendment? Was it Associated Industries of Massachusetts that brought that out? How can they be persuaded that this is in their best interest and they have to support the funding that would be required?
Well, I think it's going to be a full court press on many people or many organizations or networks of people who are going to want to work against this. But something to remember, and this also, I'm sure this comes out in every conversation we have about this, it's not, and some people will think this is unfortunate, it's not bam, this immediate investment, it's tiered growth. So we're not asking the legislature through these two pieces of legislation and other initiatives to come up with this immediate full investment. Say, for example, with the Promise Act, $1 billion plus. We're not saying it has to happen next year. We're saying it'll tier over time. And so the incremental jumps are smaller. And of course, that's strategic because it'll give the legislature time to figure out how the heck we're going to fund it. And so we should.
And on top of that, and Aaron has said this before too, but the governor was touting for a long time over the last year that we had this, what, $500 million surplus, right? And, you can't really call it a surplus if you're underfunding your constitutional obligation to fund public education, right? So there's revenue there if you're saying we have a surplus when we don't. And then number two, it's not a question of resources, it's a question of will, right? I mean, do we have the will to make this investment and raise the revenue where we need to raise it to invest in this?
Another thing I want to add to that is we did an economic impact study for Holyoke Community College when I first started, and we looked at return on investment to various stakeholders. And the one everyone said, well, it's good for students, obviously, but we also looked at the benefit to taxpayers. And for every dollar that's invested in higher education, there's a, well, specifically HCC, there's a $1.80 return on investment to taxpayers. So for something that's also just good for society, when you look at society ROI, is a $6.30 for every dollar. And for students, $3.20 for every dollar invested in higher education. I think those are pretty good returns for quality education.
I also just said on the revenue, so the governor did open up the revenue door in his budget, specifically on opioid and some other areas where he'd like to see some extra funds. I think there's just a reality of when you're the governor, when you become a mayor, that there's just not enough revenue, right? There really isn't, and I think that we do a pretty good job of being fiscally responsible. Some would say we do better, some would say we could do worse, but there's going to have to be some additional revenue. The reality is reality that everything goes up every year, and so there has to be something. And I think that we've seen, some good compromises happen when the business industry and the advocates come together. Not everybody leaves happy. Right? If you talk about the grand bargain, for instance, around minimum wage and paid leave, right? Not everybody left the table feeling like they won or lost, right? But we're moving forward and we're still working together. So I think there's a way, and the business community, has acknowledged that there's, the skills gap. They've acknowledged that there's not much investment in education. Where we get the rubber meets the road, or where we get the money.
And also workforce development, right? There's been a huge cry from the business community to really come into the 21st century jobs industries, and to do that, we're going to need to fund public hire, right? So that's a win-win for them as well.
And every business that entertains coming to Western Mass always asks the question, do you have talented workforce? Do you have the skills necessary for me to have employees to run my business? That translates into education.
So, Mr. Vega, you mentioned the weeds, right? The weeds do matter a lot because frequently the state will give with one hand and then take with another. So you mentioned things like circuit breaker reimbursements, transportation, minimum increments to Chapter 70 year over year. When you were speaking, both of you, speaking about the phase-in of the Promise Act, is there a plan to have some kind of inflation baked into the foundation budget? Because if we wait 10 years to get a proposal from 10 years ago, we've lost a lot of money.
So right now, there is an obligation that we do put in, there is an inflation obligation already. So, so the governor in his bill put forth $200 million of additional revenue into Chapter 70. 168 of that is already constitutionally supposed to do, so he's only putting in 32 million. And 15 million of that is additional Puerto Rico relief, so it's really only $17 million. But, so, yes and no. I mean, we like to say the insurance is going to be tied to the GIC cap increases, so that would be tied to inflation. And again, it gives the municipalities some leverage to say, hey, if you don't work with us, we're going to go to the state insurance plan. Like, they're only going up 3% every year. Why are you charging us 12%? So we're trying to give the municipalities a little bit of leverage in that. There is some safeguards in there to make sure that after charter school reimbursements are bailed out and never fully funded, that a per student minimum is required to go to districts. That would help places like Boston and Worcester and Springfield and Holyoke that have charter school issues. Wherever you stand on the charter school debate, the funding should be made whole. And so the issue is that, I think the last part to answer, so there's this feeling like you can't hold a future legislative body to a certain obligation financially. So in the Promise Act, the governor has a 7-year implementation for his bill spelled out. It includes lots of additional funding from municipalities. Talk about there's state aid versus foundation, right? So when you talk about the foundation budget money, he may say $1 billion in foundation over the next 7 years. That includes $500,000 from municipalities. Promise Act is talking about state aid. It's talking about the state's portion being bigger. The reason the Promise Act doesn't have a timeline per se is because we want to be a little bit flexible. We'd love it to come out of committee with a 5-year implement. We'd be open to a 5-year implementation plan, but we also want to be able to work with the municipalities. The mayor said, we work with the state. If there's a year where we have a surplus, quote unquote, we can invest more. If there's a year where times are tough, maybe we need to take a little breath and invest what we can. So we're trying to be a little bit flexible with the Promise Act on the implementation part of it, but nothing is tied to inflation going forward. And even though a lot of people think that that's a good idea, you saw what happened with the gas tax being tied to inflation, right? The voters voted it down. So people get nervous about those sort of long-term price tags.
Well, we're a little over, but I really, really appreciate all of our guests that we were able to have here today. I think it's really important that we have these meaningful conversations in open spaces, and that we come together as a community, regardless of what your role is in the community or within the school. It's important that we're all able to talk respectfully and productively and really outline what that future could look like for ourselves and for our students and for our community overall. So I would just like to give another round of applause to our guests.
Thank you.